The reason for the diversification, it's very similar to why you would diversify an economic portfolio. You want to diversify your economic portfolio because you don't know what's going to happen to any given stock or any given other asset. And when you diversify, you both make sure that you're getting a good probability of benefits and that you're mitigating the probability of risk. So in the case of nutrients, the benefits are the different nutritional profiles. Meat has just a different distribution of nutrients than fish has, which has a different distribution of nutrients than eggs or fish. So if you say, I need to have a certain amount of protein every day, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm drawing from all these different sources, you are much more likely to meet all your nutritional needs.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We're your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey everybody, I'm Hilda Labrada Gore. This is episode 156, and my guest today is Chris Masterjohn, PhD. Nope, this is not deja vu. He spoke to us last week about Dr. Weston A. Price and the powerful discoveries he made about the importance of a nutrient-dense diet. We invited Chris back on the show today to bring it full circle. How can we really eat this nutrient-dense Wise Traditions way, practically in the day-to-day? Well, Chris gives us his rules of thumb for maximizing nutrients and making sure they are bioaccessible to our bodies. His main emphasis? The need to diversify our diets. He explains it all, mixing in stories about Dr. Price, warning us about the dangers of dietary extremes, and giving us a window into the way he himself puts into practice the Wise Traditions diet. Before we dive into the conversation, we want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors who help keep the show on the air. Wise Traditions is supported in part by Vintage Tradition Tallow Balm, the original whole food of skincare. Check out their new products, including a non-toxic paperboard tube for lips and on the go. Get yours now at vintagetradition.com. And Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. New Zealand-sourced liver, organ meats, and bone marrow in convenient gelatin capsules. Order yours today at ancestralsupplements.com. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Chris.
Thanks, Hilda. It's great to be here.
So the last time we had you on, we talked a lot about the work of Dr. Price and its significance in terms of our well-being. I want you to just give us a quick recap of the 4 major categories of foods that Dr. Price saw that traditional peoples included in their diet. And then I want you to springboard into how we can master and measure our nutrition to kind of match that, if you will.
Yeah, I'd love to. So Price put a lot of emphasis on the fat-soluble vitamins because they're not because they're more important, but because they're harder to get in the diet, and you have to really understand them and make effort to get them. And when he looked at all the traditional diets, as different as they were across the world, he kind of distilled all that information to say that all the traditional diets got at least one of these 4 categories as a source of fat-soluble vitamins. First category was organ meats and egg yolks. The second category was dairy products, which included the fat. The third category was the animal life of the sea, which included shellfish and which included thin fish, but not just the fillets, but also the heads and the organs, the liver, etc. And then the fourth category, which is the one that's most foreign to most of us, was small animals such as frogs and insects. Mm-hmm. And he said, you don't have to eat all of these, but you have to have at least one and preferably more to make sure that you have a good level of fat-soluble vitamins in your diet.
So in other words, he saw these traditional people groups eating these foods, and not only did he see that, but he took samples of their food back to his lab in the United States to analyze, and this is the conclusion that he reached.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the relevance of taking the foods back to his laboratories was that he also emphasized that the foods that they were eating in the traditional groups were more nutritious than the same foods when other people would eat them. So he didn't do this with all the foods. Like, he didn't do this with shellfish, to my knowledge, but he measured over 20,000 samples of butter, and the butter fat in the Swiss Valley, where the traditionally living people was several times higher in fat soluble vitamins than it was elsewhere in Switzerland, because butter was not a food that was only eaten by traditional people. And so if you look at why, it's actually because they cared for their soil so much. So they had soil from glacial deposits, but they cared about their soil so much that when it would rain, the children would go out and collect the soil by hand that would run off from the rain and put it back.
Oh my God.
So that, the care for the soil was a big part of why those foods were so nutritious.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so let's just say that you've sold me. I want to include more of these foods in my diet, but how can I be sure I'm getting the right amounts and stuff to attain the health that I'm going after?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the drawbacks of Price's work, is that there's not a lot of quantitative data. There's a lot of qualitative stuff. Like, these are the foods that were emphasized by this group. There's not a lot of, well, they ate 6 ounces of this and they ate 10 ounces of that, and they, we don't really have that from Price's work. And I also think to a large extent, there are a lot of unknowns that I think were unknown even to Price. So there were some cases where he did try to publish more outside of nutrition and physical degeneration. There were some journal articles that he published for a couple of the groups where he made some quantitative estimates of the foods that they were eating and in what proportions. But for the most part, he didn't. And in some cases, he didn't really have time. So, for example, one of the things you'll notice from nutrition and physical degeneration is that the risk of infectious diseases was so high in Africa that he spent very little time there. And all of the many African groups that he studied are condensed into a chapter. And, in some cases, he got to spend a lot of time with some groups. In other cases, he was spending a few days with each group. And so he collected less dietary information. So we have a lot of unknowns in terms of, how do I organize this diet? And so what I've done with my own expertise and with my own research into the distribution of nutrients in foods is I've tried to put together some quantitative rules that can help people. And so I'm going to give you a list of a handful of these rules. And I'll preface this by saying that the list of these rules assumes that you don't have any food intolerances, you don't have any known specific health issues that might alter your nutritional requirements, and you don't have any data, for example, from blood tests or urine tests that are telling us about your specific needs. So this is, you're an otherwise healthy person. What are the good rules of thumb to follow? And so the first rule of thumb, I would say, is you want to diversify your protein among meat, fish, shellfish, other invertebrates. For example, there's shellfish. You could also be eating insects. Crickets are a big thing now. Eggs and dairy products. And the reason for the diversification, it's very similar to why you would diversify an economic portfolio. You want to diversify your economic portfolio because you don't know what's going to happen to any given stock or any given other asset. And when you diversify, you both make sure that you're getting a good probability of benefits and that you're mitigating the probability of risk. So in the case of nutrients, the benefits are the different nutritional profiles. Meat has just a different distribution of nutrients than fish has, which has a different distribution of nutrients than eggs or fish. So if you say, I need to have a certain amount of protein every day, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm drawing from all these different sources, you are much more likely to meet all your nutritional needs. And then it's also the case that any given food has potential harmful things in it. And the more you diversify, the more you make sure that you're not overloading on any given one particular food that might actually have some kind of harmful component when it's provided in excess. So I would take this diversification principle then within an animal. To diversify means to eat more nose to tail. And that means to the extent that you can, to the extent that your palate can tolerate it, try to work in the organ meats, try to work in the bones, and so on. An easy way to start doing that is to eat liver once a week, try to include the bones in making soups and stocks and so on. But then, of course, there's always more that you can do. There are plenty of organ meats other than liver that you can get into. And there are plenty of other ways to incorporate bones. In some cases, you have edible bones. A good example would be in canned fish. You have bones, like in canned sardines, for example. The bones are cooked. They're very easy to eat. You don't even really notice them. If you roasted chicken, a lot of the bones are small enough to eat the ends off of them.
Another thing I do is that I buy beef or lamb from the farm that has some organ meat mixed in, so you can hardly even notice that it's in there.
Yeah, I had that for lunch. So the third rule of thumb would be to get about 1,000 milligrams of calcium a day. And the easiest way to do this is to get 3 servings of dairy products or 3 servings of edible bones, or to mix and match them. One point of confusion is that bone broth and stock is not a good source of calcium. It's a great source of other things, but it doesn't have a lot of calcium. And so when I say bones, I actually mean edible bones, and I don't mean bone broth. But edible bones or dairy products are the easiest way to get calcium. If you're relying on plant foods for calcium, I think that it's very important to note that some plant foods, the calcium is very poor bioavailability. For example, spinach, the absorption of calcium is about 5% from spinach, so I wouldn't really count it. The cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and kale, for example, do have good calcium absorption, but the amounts that you need to get enough calcium are very high. So I think it's okay for the plant foods to make a partial contribution to your calcium intake, but I think that for people who are not eating edible bones or dairy products, you really need to kind of analyze your calcium intake and make sure that you get enough. And there's probably a good basis for supplementation if you're not eating either of those foods. Going beyond that, I would say to take the same diversification principle that we put for the animal foods, now we put that in plant foods. So you're going to get a certain amount of carbohydrate a day. Maybe how much you need is going to depend on your lifestyle, especially your physical activity and what makes you feel the best. But to the extent that, whatever amount of carbohydrate you are eating, diversify those carbohydrates among legumes, whole grains, starchy tubers, and fruits. If you're going to cut something out of that, I think the thing that's most okay to cut out is the grains. But if you tolerate grains fine, then I think it's good to include them and to diversify. And again, the principle is the same. All these foods have some things that might be bad for you in great excess, but they also have different profiles of what's good for you. And in particular, the reason that I say it's okay to keep out the grains versus some of these other ones is because all of these except potassium is much higher in legumes, starchy tubers, and fruits than it is in grains. And vitamin C is much higher in fruits than it is in any of those other foods. And so it's best to include them all for that reason.
So I'm thinking of our ancestors, and let's say I had relatives in Mexico. Well, actually, I do have relatives in Mexico, but I'm thinking back to my ancestors in Mexico. Let's say they lived in a particular part of the jungle. It seems to me they wouldn't be able to make their diet as diverse as you're saying because they only have certain things available, like maybe they just eat the same boar they killed a couple days ago, a wild boar that they found, or they're having the same plants that are always available. Like, I just can't picture them mixing it up as much as you're describing. Do you think they were just healthier because they were living closer to the land? Help me understand.
Well, I actually think the opposite would be the case. So I think if you're talking about people who are hunter-gatherers in the jungle, I think they're going to be forced into diversifying far more than anyone would diversify based on my rules of thumb. I mean, it's both the fact that there's not enough of any one thing, and it's also the fact that they're going to have such an enormous amount of knowledge that's been passed on about the edibleness and the benefits of all the different plant foods that we don't know about. So, I mean, I'll be the first to admit that I don't really know anything about the details of the plant foods eaten by your ancestors, but I will say that just to take a group that I've studied a little bit more. So the Maasai are famous for not eating plant foods, but it looks very different if you read a paper by ethnobotanists who have studied the Maasai. So the earliest records are that the Maasai knew of, about, and used over 140 different plant foods. And I mean, I follow my rules of thumb. I don't have anywhere near 140 plant foods in my diet. I have 120. So I just don't know enough about. I just haven't studied Peru, but I can't imagine that gatherers would not have access to an incredible diverse array of foods. I would also say that, if you look at the archaeological record, it's pretty clear that diversification is super important, and that as diversification has decreased, one of the things that people have done is develop ways to cope with it. So if you look at the transition to agriculture, it's marked by initially a very sharp decline in height and increase in tooth decay. And then those factors get mitigated later on. And in fact, if you look at modern day agriculturalists like us, we're taller than all the existing hunter-gatherers, and our teeth aren't that bad. We have tooth decay, we have dental deformities, we have braces, but they're not the worst that they've been in human history. So what happened is, now some people will point to that and they'll say that, this is an intrinsic problem with grains. But hunter-gatherers ate grains. We know hunter-gatherers ate grains. We found in the archaeological record grains in the teeth of hunter-gatherers. But hunter-gatherers never had the opportunity to eat 90% of their diet as one grain or to eat 90% of their diet as grains. They both had the knowledge of many other things to eat, but they also were in perpetual food shortage. I mean, that's right. The thing that characterizes hunter-gatherer lifestyle is that you go to gather because you don't really know what you're going to get that day, and you're going to go get what you find. And so kind of being at the mercy of your environment, when you run out of one thing, you have to get another, right? So the hunter-gatherer lifestyle really forces diversification. And my perspective on what happened in the agricultural revolution is we had a sudden decimation of the principle of diversity, to the point where we said, we looked at it economically and said, hey, with these finite resources, I can do this, and I can have incredibly amounts of wheat that we've never had before, amounts of corn that we've never had before. And what happens is that you don't realize that eating 90% of your diet is wheat or 90% of your diet is corn has disastrous consequences until you do it. And then when you do it, you say, hey, we need to do something about this. And you figure out nutritional strategies to mitigate that. And one of those strategies might be to eat less corn, but one of those strategies might also be to eat other things, right? You can have 80% of your calories coming from one thing that's not very good if the 20% of your diet is so perfect that it compensates for that. But what I'm saying is it's way easier to just diversify than to think about how am I going to manage my nutrition on an 80% corn diet.
Good point. Good point. I see what you're saying about the diversification of the diet of our ancestors. And really, Chris, you're challenging all of us. So many of us eat the same thing day after day, and we really need to mix it up. So is there something else you would suggest?
I do kind of eat the same thing every day, but I rotate things and I mix things. So I have mixed vegetables that are cooked in batches. And so right now I got this thing in the refrigerator that I've been eating for my vegetables for the past 3 or 4 days. Every meal, this is my vegetables, but it's got a bunch of different stuff in it. It's got mushrooms in it. It's got some different, green beans. It's got some leafy greens. It's got just a bunch of things combined. So there are ways to kind of not be like eating something different all the time,
okay,
and still incorporate the diversity.
Coming up, Chris tells us about 2 final rules of thumb for diversifying our diet and making sure that all of the nutrients we're taking in are bioaccessible. Plus, he wraps it all up with a simple suggestion to get us moving in the right direction when it comes to eating the Wise Traditions way.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Chris has put his practical what-to-do information all distilled into one place. It's Testing Nutritional Status, the ultimate cheat sheet, with everything you could ever need to know to optimize your nutrition. You'll learn how to optimize your vitamins, minerals, and essential fatty acids. You'll know what lab work to order and more. It can be accessed as a PDF, Kindle, or iBook. And listeners will get a special discount at checkout using the coupon code WISETRADITIONS. So check it out at chrismasterjohnphd.com/wisetraditions. And also Ancestral Supplements. They offer New Zealand-sourced bone marrow and nose-to-tail organ meats like liver, heart, kidney, pancreas, spleen, and more in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. Traditional peoples and early ancestral healers believed that eating the organs from a healthy animal would strengthen and support the health of the corresponding organ of the individual. In other words, a person with a weak heart was fed the heart of a healthy animal, and so on. I know I personally don't always get enough organ meats in my diet, so I went ahead and got some ancestral supplements of my own. Visit ancestralsupplements.com today to see what it can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out.
So I'd add 2 more rules of thumb. The next one, and this is sort of the last one, maybe the except the bonus one. So the last one is to eat several cups of vegetables a day. And I think you want to diversify the colors. You definitely want to make sure that some of them are dark green. And then the final thing, which is sort of the bonus thing, like I think all the rules of thumb that I just gave you kind of ensure that you're getting enough nutrients. But the last thing I would say is incorporate some digestive support at every meal. And digestive support could be things like ginger or Swedish bitters, could be things like fermented foods, whether it's sauerkraut or kimchi or raw apple cider vinegar or anything like that. And then some people, for example, would need digestive enzyme supplements. You kind of have to measure that against what makes you feel like you're digesting everything. But the principle here is that you can have all the nutrients in your diet, but that doesn't do anything unless they get into your body, right? So you have to have good digestion in order to extract the nutrients from those foods and make sure they're getting in.
So I was talking to someone recently who told me they were going to go on the carnivore diet, so mostly meat, I guess. And they said at the same time they were going to start cutting back on kombucha and fermented foods. And I thought, wow, don't you need the enzymes from those foods to help you digest the meat? So what would you say to someone who was going to try something like that?
Well, I wouldn't recommend the carnivore diet unless someone had kind of exhausted their options and had some health problems that couldn't be resolved otherwise. I mean, so there's no scientific studies of carnivore diets resolving any problems, but there are plenty of anecdotes. And so if you're reading about someone's psoriasis recovered on the carnivore diet, I think it's okay to try that, but I wouldn't try it until you've pretty much exhausted every other option. And that's for 2 reasons. One, first of all, there's nothing even remotely natural about the carnivore diet. It's about as natural as veganism, which is, not natural at all. And then the second thing is that it's completely violates all the rules of diversification that I just laid out. But I mean, if you look at Price's work, Price didn't emphasize this, but there wasn't any group anywhere on planet Earth that Price found that only ate animal products. The people who are most famous for eating only animal products are the Inuit and the Maasai. The Maasai actually ate a diet that was very rich in starches. In fact, they ate bananas and legumes and all kinds of things like that they traded with other tribes. They traded milk for those things. In the Inuit, there's something sort of accurate about it in the sense that the Arctic environment does restrict the amount of plant foods that they could eat. But even if you read Price's chapter on the Inuit, I mean, if you just look at the foods that Price lists out, I think like at least half or maybe even 2/3 or 3/4 of the list of specific foods that Price says that they ate were plant foods. And that's not because they ate more plant foods than animal foods. They were eating more of the animal foods because the plant foods that they ate were in more limited supply. I'm just noting the irony that if you look at that list, like the thing they list out, there's a bunch of plant foods. In fact, I have not read this book, but I think Honora Jones is her name. She wrote a book, The Plant Foods That We Eat, and it was a whole book about plant foods eaten in the Arctic. If I remember correctly, I might have that wrong because I haven't read it. But yeah, there's just no traditionally living group on the planet that ate only animal foods. And Price did emphasize this a little more, that there also was no living human group on the planet that ate only plant foods. So he went to one of the Pacific Islands where he hoped to find people who were living just on plant foods. What his theory was that the people who were isolated to the mountaintop and landlocked would be eating mostly plant foods because all the animal foods were from the sea on this island. And so he thought, okay, the people on the coast will eat the animal foods from the sea. The people in the top of the mountain will be eating mostly plant foods. What he found was that there was this giant wall of shellfish shells. And when he inquired why this big wall was there, what he found was that even when the groups were warring with one another, the coast dwellers would come deliver shellfish from the sea at this wall. And then the people from the mountain, while they were at war with one another, would come down in the night, take the shellfish, and leave plant foods there in trade. And he doesn't go into more detail about the background of this in Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, but I found an article where he did. And the background of this story is that the reason that they were at war was because the people who were isolated to the mountaintop, who had only plant foods in their immediate environment, knew that they had to eat animal foods about once every 3 months to not have their health fall apart. And their principal way of getting those animal foods was to hunt the fishermen of the coastline, because they knew that the fishermen who had the most access to the livers of the fish, that they had the most nutritious livers. So they would hunt the fishermen and harvest their livers and eat the livers of the fishermen. And so that was why they were at war. And that was why the coast dwellers were so eager to appease them when they were at war, because they didn't want to get eaten, right? So Price looked for vegans and he only found cannibals. So anyway, I mean, there is a basis for restrictive diets, and my rules of thumb are not for people who need restrictive diets. They're just for people who don't have any specific needs. But you're kind of pushing this in the direction of, well, what if you do have specific needs? And I think that when you can't follow the principles of diversification, it becomes more important to actually monitor and manage your nutritional status. And I think it's a good idea for everyone to be somewhat proactive about this. But I think the more restrictive you are, whether you're restricting animal foods or plant foods or just specific kinds of carbohydrate or whatever it is, the more restrictive you are, the more your risk increases of not getting what you need. And the more you have to emphasize being proactive about managing your nutritional status for specific nutrients.
Yeah, I think we're just so drawn to extremes and to deprivation in our search for good health that we think, oh, if I just stay away from this certain food group, I'll be much better. But in light of what you're saying, we may be doing ourselves more harm than good when we take that approach.
Yes, there's that. And then there's also, in our quest to do something good, we may actually do something good, but that doesn't mean that we're not also doing something bad. And so I think it's not just restrictive dieting. It's also two important principles here. Your nutritional needs are going to be different than mine because you and I are different. And this is true of everyone. We're all a little bit different. And the rules of thumb that I laid out are targeted towards the average, but I'm not the average and you're not the average. And then the second principle is that my nutritional needs right now are not going to be the same at some other point in my life. They're going to be different, and they've been different in the past. And so those two principles,
Mm-hmm.
That your needs are different than mine, and that mine are different than they might be at some other time. Yours are different now than they might be at some other time, are again reasons why we do need to be conscious about, even when we're following the rules or doing what we think is good, we really need to pay more careful attention. We need to be on the lookout for problems that might arise. And the way that this can act or manifest in someone who's following a restricted diet for a good reason is that, let's say that someone goes on carnivore because they're very sensitive to certain harmful things in plants. There's all kinds of harmful things in plants. There's lectins, there's oxalates, there's, just a plethora of things that can be potentially harmful. And so maybe they just cut out all plant foods, and they don't know exactly what they were reacting to, but they were reacting to something, and now it's gone. And so that was a very simple and easy way to cut out the thing that they didn't know what it was that was causing whatever their problem was. And so at first, this is very good, because now whatever was their worst problem is gone. But now maybe they are not getting enough vitamin C. Now maybe they're not getting enough potassium. Now maybe they're not getting enough molybdenum. Whatever it is, it could take months for that to become relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe if they're designing the carnivore diet pretty good, they're mitigating that loss. But maybe they're not mitigating it to the point that in 5 years, they're not running deficient in that. And so the thing that you did that was good can become the thing that you did that was bad later. and that's why I don't think the big problem is that we're all trying to deprive ourselves. I think the big problem is that we're all trying to fit food into 2 boxes of good and evil. And so we just get this very black and white dichotomy of good and bad, when in fact it's all contextual, right? Like, especially when you're talking about the natural foods that we know have good track records in human diets. We can argue about whether white flour is intrinsically evil or something like that. Like, you can make a case for it because you can make a case that it's not actually a food, right? But when you're talking about the thousands upon thousands of edible plant and animal species that have been part of the human diet for time immemorial, then you're doing more harm than good when you try to start making 2 boxes, good and bad, and then shoving everything into one or the other box. And people generalize from their experience too much. So they cut something out and they feel better, so they put that thing in the bad box.
Exactly.
But in fact, maybe it was just that they had to cut it out in that context, and maybe the context is different later.
Wow, you've given us a lot of good food for thought. I know I'm going to be looking at my diet a little differently now. And so I want to ask you, if we were all sold out and encouraged by what you've said, and we want to change our diet and diversify it, whether it's including more plant food or what have you, what would be a good first step to following some of these guidelines that you've given us today?
I think the first step that I think a lot of people would not have met would be to start eating organ meats. So eating liver once a week would be a good first step for a lot of people. A lot of people who are listening to this probably already do that.
They might.
Yeah. So I mean, some of these people might want the good first step. Some people might want the good 10th step. I'm not sure.
Well, we'll let them decide about that. Listen, Chris, it's been a great conversation today, and we will see you. Hey, everybody, if you want to be in on the fun, join us in Baltimore in November, the 16th to the 19th. We're going to be at this amazing conference together, and Chris is going to do a whole full-day seminar on measuring and mastering our nutrition. So thanks again for taking the time to give us a little taste of what you have to offer this November, Chris, and we'll see you soon. My guest today was Chris Masterjohn. Visit his website, chrismasterjohnphd.com, for more of his offerings. And don't forget to check out his podcast, Mastering Nutrition. And take advantage of the cheat sheet for dietary analysis and recommendations that Chris is offering. You will also find a link to this offer in the show notes so you can access it easily. You can find it on the podcast page of our website under episode 156. On that same page, you'll see our listener survey. Just take a moment to fill it out. We want to get to know you better, and thank you. Also, remember that you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a thing. And don't forget to review and rate the show on iTunes when possible. Next week, everybody, we speak with Tom Naughton. Tom is the former stand-up comedian who realized that we needed to take our health more seriously. He says we've been fed a lot of low-fat baloney when it comes to nutrition advice, and he's made the documentary Fathead and written the book Fathead Kids to turn things around. In our conversation, he talks about the wisdom of the crowds as opposed to the wisdom of health experts, and that's wisdom in quotes, for discerning what is best for us. It's a great and entertaining conversation that you won't want to miss. Finally, a quick thank you to our faithful team of podcast interns. Post-production assistants include Cassie Reeve, Diva Rizvi, Melanie Ahern, and Ari O'Hara. Cheryl Heftelin helps with social media. Mary Hine, Olga de Villiers, and Joy de los Santos boost sponsorship and help with special projects. Our listening team includes Heather Carpentier and Victor Coseto. And Amy Matias helps with transcriptions. Music is from the soundtrack Sunny Side Up from Michelle Bloom's CD Big Backyard. Find out more about her music at allthingsbloom.com. So that's it. Let's keep in touch, everybody. I'm on Instagram at holistic_Hilda. Follow me for health tips, podcast stuff, and behind the scenes on the show and me. Thanks, and see you soon. Oh, and if you're still listening, look for my podcasting book called Podcasting Made Simple. It's now available for pre-order on Amazon. If you've ever wondered if you should launch a show, do it. I break it all down for you in this book so you can get it done in no time. Check it out, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening today. We have all kinds of resources to support you on your health journey. On the Weston A. Price Foundation website, you'll find podcasts, blogs, articles, and brochures related to just about any health topic you can imagine. You can also find a local chapter to help you discover sources of real, organic food in your area. And you can become a member to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism. Visit westonaprice.org for all this and more. And remember that the Wise Traditions podcast is available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.